Howdy. We're on to list 2, and today I'm going to show you 10 plants that are, well, maybe a little more spectacular than last week's. We're going to start with Campsis tagliabuana Madam Galen. It's actually Campsis X, or Campsis cross tagliabuana. It's named for the Tagliabue brothers who owned a nursery in Italy in the 19th century. This is the result. Madam Galen is actually a French selection of that hybrid. The hybrid is between the Chinese Campsis grandiflora and the American Campsis radicans. And when they made that hybrid, they noticed that the flowers were bigger, that the plant was more cold hardy than the Chinese one, and so basically intermediate between those two, and a really good climbing plant. There are a couple of things about the fact that this is a climber that we may need to go over, and one is that this is what's called a self-sticking climber, and it self-sticks by virtue of roots that it produces, and you can see, and we'll have a close-up of those roots, but it produces roots along the stems, and those roots we call adventitious roots. That means appearing in a place that they wouldn't normally, where roots normally don't appear. Adventitious roots. And so it sticks to structures. It's not very good at sticking to itself, but it sticks to structures like wood, or in the wild it would probably climb on trees, and it climbs up to a point, and as soon as it gets to the top of whatever it is growing on, then it starts to produce branches, and it flowers, and there we are. And so when you're using this in the landscape, it needs to be, you need to have something that it can grow upon. So one of the things that I noticed in the assignments that people were having some trouble with is this concept of the compound leaf. And this is a pinnately compound leaf. That's a compound leaf. These are not individual leaves. This is the individual leaf. And we can tell when we're looking at a compound leaf because at the base of the leaf, you'll find an axillary bud. And that axillary bud is tucked way in a campsis. It's very hard to see. So you have to actually look very closely sometimes to see whether or not you're looking at an axillary bud. If you look along the rachis here between the leaflets, you will not find axillary buds. And so that's my first rule of botany. So the leaf structure, this is a typical pinnately compound leaf. These leaves are toothed, and they have, sorry, that's probably distracting. And they have very long drip tips on the end. This is, both species are adapted to high rainfall, and that's why they have these drip tips. But the leaves are opposite, that is, they're compound leaves, pinnately compound leaves, that are oppositely arranged. And if you flip the leaf over, the backside of the leaf is slightly more reflective and a little lighter in color. With respect to Madam Galen, Madam Galen is a cultivar. That is, it is a selection that was made by people, and so it's the same whether you see Madam Galen in Italy, or you see it in China, or you see it in Vancouver. But it is a hybrid, and not all hybrids are sterile, but this is a sterile hybrid. And so after it finishes flowering, the base of the flower, the calyx part, which you can see here, it essentially just falls off and you're left with nothing. In the wild species of Campsis would, if they were pollinated, they would form a fruit, which is a long string bean of a fruit. So no flowers, no fruit. This is a climber that is relatively popular in the Vancouver area. You see it. It's a little bit rambunctious, as you can see. It really wants to grow, but it's ideal. It's an ideal plant for covering an old shed or a tall fence or structure. You know, a good strong structure in the garden. And the interesting thing about Campsis is that it will flower at the top of any structure. As I said before, it climbs up to a point, and as soon as it hits the open, then it flowers. If you plant it over a doghouse, it will flower on top of the doghouse, or it will flower on top of a shed, or it will flower if it has to grow 10 or 15 meters, it will climb up to the top to get into the light and then flower. Finally, a little bit about what it wants in the landscape. It's actually fairly easy plant to grow, regular garden soil. It likes some moisture in the summer. It's adapted to a summer moisture regime, and it prefers not to have saturated soil in the winter, which means that we need to have well-drained soil. And it's a plant that requires sun. If it doesn't get sun, then it's not going to flower. And so we have it planted here on the east side, or facing southeast, which is ideal. If you plant it on the west side, it's a little bit hotter, and the flowers tend to be finished faster. So that's Campsis tagliabiana, Madam Galen. This is Cotinus cogigria. Now, this is something that I want you to maybe repeat to yourself out loud, just so that you get the hang of the name. It's people often find it difficult, Cotinus or Cotinus, but cogigria is it's got a weird spelling, and it comes from the Greek, which is why it has so many hard sounds. But anyway, if you say it a few times, you'll figure it out. Now, this is a tree, but it's generally grown as a shrub, and I want you to classify it as a shrub. It's a deciduous shrub that, if allowed to grow for 50 or 60 years, will become a small tree. But because we're not looking at 50 or 60-year-old plants in the landscape primarily, we're calling it a shrub. And it grows in 20 years, it's probably going to grow to 3 meters or so, which is a nice shrub size. Now, you'll notice that this has green leaves. There are purple-leafed and yellow-leafed versions of Cotinus cogigria as well. This is a sort of typical wild type with the green leaves. It's actually less commonly cultivated than the purple-leafed type, which is very, very common. And what you're seeing here, this smoky, fluffy stuff, this is where the seeds are found. And we'll take a closer look, but the little brown seeds are embedded in this sort of flyaway stuff. And that's the whole point, is that this is flyaway stuff. And when you get a big wind, this can fly around, and that's how the seeds are dispersed. The leaves themselves, as I said, are deciduous, and they're very, very distinctive I'm just going to take this off. It's in the way. You can see the leaves are arranged alternately on the stem, and the leaves themselves are almost round in outline, or we'd call these probably ovate or broadly ovate to, I would call them broadly ovate at this point. If you want to look at the buds are very, very tiny, but they are visible. They're usually black or blackish. You will notice that they have an entire margin. That is, there are no lobes and no teeth. And they're very, very smooth. It's a very neat looking shrub. And then it produces its flowers. The flowers are a little less dense than this. The flower structure is less dense than this, little yellow flowers. And then it's followed by this kind of thickening up of the fruits and the structures around the fruits. And there's not much more to say about Cotinus in terms of its shape. It's often pruned horribly in the landscape. If allowed to grow, it becomes a very, very elegant kind of sculptural plant. It looks great almost any time of the year. It grows it's native to southern Europe, where it grows where it's warm. It likes heat. You can grow it in the full sun. It'll take a little bit of shade, but it doesn't flower very well, and it gets very floppy in the shade. So you want to grow it where the soil is dry, and where it's well drained, and where there's lots of heat, and that keeps it compact and looking great. And it was a favorite plant many years ago. It was a favorite plant for highway embankments. That is places with sort of sandy soil that never got watered. And you still sometimes see the purple-leafed Cotinus on highway embankments. This is Hydrangea macrophylla. We call this the common hydrangea. It's called the common hydrangea because it's very common. And as you can see, this is a very different hydrangea than Hydrangea paniculata that we saw previously. It's also a large shrub. This is a shrub that's capable of growing 3 or 4 meters tall, but there are lots and lots of selections of Hydrangea macrophylla. Many of them are much more in the 1.5 meter range, and so as garden plants go, this is an excellent plant because of size and summer flowering. This particular cultivar, which is, I won't bore you with the actual name of this cultivar, but it is a type of common hydrangea known as a lace cap hydrangea. Notice the sterile florets or sterile flowers surrounding a kind of center of fertile flowers, and these fertile flowers are actually open right now, and so we'll be able to take a look at that. And in fact, some of the sterile flowers actually also have fertile flowers in them, but that's a little bit unusual. This is a selection where the sterile flowers predominate, whereas in the lace cap, the inflorescence is flattened, what we call a corymb, and a corymb is a raceme where the flowers are either flattened or a little bit rounded. This is actually a compound corymb. You can see lots of branching in here. But let me get back to the what we call a mop head type of hydrangea, and this has sterile flowers predominating, and if you open up the inflorescence, you can see the occasional fertile flower on the inside, but there are very, very few of them. And what that does is it contributes to this sort of ball shape, or this pom-pom effect. And the lace cap type would be the more common hydrangea you would see in the wild in Japan, but there's a tendency for the lace cap to mutate and produce all sterile flower, almost all sterile flowers, and those are the plants that people have selected because they're unusual and some would say showier. Now this is a lighter blue. There are hundreds of hydrangea cultivars. What I want you to note, though, is that the two types look very different, but it's the same species. Some of you will notice that these flowers are blue. They have a little bit of kind of purple in the sterile flowers. And hydrangea flower color is often misunderstood, but the common hydrangea and a few other hydrangea species, not including the typically white flowered hydrangeas like Hydrangea paniculata or Hydrangea quercifolia, but the colored flowered hydrangeas typically respond to the amount of aluminum that's available in the soil. And in a soil that has an acid reaction, aluminum is actually freely available to the roots, and that aluminum is taken up into the plant, into the flowers, and the presence of aluminum makes the flowers blue. Without aluminum, the flowers are more pink. And if we have a soil that is not acidic, that is either neutral or alkaline in reaction, then typically any aluminum that's in the soil is bound up and is not available to the roots, which means that in an alkaline or a neutral soil, the hydrangea flowers will be pink. The buds on Hydrangea macrophylla are much more typically opposite, and they're fairly large, more or less obvious the later into the winter we get. So by the time we get to midwinter or late winter, the buds are very prominent along the stems. The leaves themselves are very thick and almost rubbery feeling. The top of the leaf, the veins are deeply impressed, and the back of the leaf you can really feel the veins prominent on the underside. That the leaf arrangement, this is very obviously opposite, the leaves opposite each other, but you'll note when you look down that you see that each pair of leaves is at right angles to the leaf below it. And that's a very typical kind of arrangement when you have an opposite leaf arrangement, but it's not universal. It's just really obvious with hydrangea. You'll also notice these fairly coarse serrations, and as I said before, the opposite buds. So the other thing about the leaf you'll notice is how dark green it is, and the more shade we have hydrangea in, typically the darker the leaf. And as you can see, this looks like a very happy individual. And a half a day of shade is probably ideal for hydrangeas. You can grow hydrangeas in the sun. The flowers don't last as long. They're still healthy. They probably even flower more prolifically, but you're better off with a half a day of shade. In full shade, you get very, very little in the way of flowers. Great foliage, but floppy stems and not so many flowers. Okay, this is Hydrangea paniculata, and you may remember from last week Chloroturia paniculata. The name referred to the inflorescence, that is the shape of the cluster of flowers. It was a panicle, and indeed this particular hydrangea has a paniculate inflorescence. It's a shrub, it's a large shrub, typically more commonly known in colder climates than in Vancouver because it's a very, very hardy shrub. It's a deciduous shrub, and it produces its leaves and buds either opposite each other or in a whorled arrangement. And that whorled arrangement, in this case, 3 leaves arising at a node. And so you'll find 3 buds at each node rather than 2. You see at the base of this stem, we have just a pair of leaves. And this is one of the curious things about Hydrangea paniculata. Whereas most hydrangeas produce opposite leaves, Hydrangea paniculata produces opposite leaves and then switches to whorled leaves. So it's a little bit odd. The leaves themselves are more or less ovate or elliptic, and they have a serrated edge. The back of the leaf is lighter in color. They're kind of papery, the leaves. These flowers in the inflorescence, these are actually finished. They were open and reproductive more than a month ago. But, and this is the real value of hydrangea, is that the inflorescence maintains itself looking like open flowers well past the time when it is reproductive. And so in this case, you'll see that we have 2 kinds of flowers. We have the larger, what we call flag flowers. These are sterile flowers. And then within the inflorescence, you can see that there are smaller flowers. These are the fertile flowers, and these are all starting now to develop seed. And the advantage here is that the sterile flowers attract pollinators to very, very small flowers, which would normally not be as attractive to pollinators. And so I'm not sure why the sterile flowers don't just fall off, because they're not really of any value to at least no value that I can think of. But you'll notice that the sterile flowers start to turn pink. And this, again, is very, very typical of white hydrangeas generally, not just this species, but white hydrangeas generally will tend to take on these ruddy pink tones as they age. And this is going to look really attractive for at least a month or 6 weeks, well into the autumn when the leaves start to fall off. The fruits themselves are tiny little capsules, and they're going to produce a few seeds within each capsule, and little birds are fond of going and extracting the seeds out of those capsules. Otherwise, they just, as the stems blow around in the winter, the seeds are distributed. In terms of plant ecology, hydrangeas are very, very tough plants. In general, they're going to be good garden plants. They tolerate a wide variety of soils, and they'll tolerate some drought in the summer. Although, and I'll point this out when we look at a couple of other hydrangeas, when we have a droughty summer, if they're not getting enough moisture, then the flowers tend to be less showy, they tend to be smaller, and they tend to, the duration of the flower is much less. This is Hydrangea quercifolia, perhaps the most distinctive of all hydrangeas. I say that because although it's a shrub, like most other hydrangeas, it has leaves that are unlike those of any other hydrangeas. And the name Hydrangea quercifolia refers to the fact that the leaves look uncannily like the leaves of the red oak, Quercus rubra. They are, of course, different textured. They have a surface that's what we call bullate, that is a little kind of bubbly on the surface. This is a shrub that's potentially upwards of 3 or 4 meters tall, but it's more comfortable as a sprawling shrub. You can see here that it's taking up quite a bit of real estate. And this is not a shrub that you want to grow in a confined space, because it really looks best if it's allowed to sprawl in a relaxed sort of way. Like all hydrangeas, opposite leaves. Unlike most hydrangeas, pinnately lobed leaves, and again I said with a bullate upper surface, and the underside you can see that the opposite of those sort of puckers and prominent veins. At this time of the year, the color of the leaves is starting to darken. You get little red or burgundy tints, which is very nice. And the flowers, which are produced in the summer, just like Hydrangea paniculata, they look an awful lot like Hydrangea paniculata. But if you look inside, past those sterile flowers, you can see lots and lots of fertile flowers. And then as the flowers age, again, just like Hydrangea paniculata, they tend to go pink. And so we'll show you that in a second. Hydrangea quercifolia is very much like other hydrangeas in that it likes sort of half a day of shade. It's perhaps a little bit better adapted to the full sun, and it certainly takes on red tints in the full sun. It's a good summer flowering shrub. It's deciduous, but in a mild winter it will often hold on to many of its leaves, and so we would call that a semi-deciduous, or some people might call it a semi-evergreen plant, but I think I'd like you to call it a deciduous shrub. Now, another thing about the leaves you'll notice is that they are quite variable in size, from tiny leaves to, I have some leaves over here that are easily 15 or 20 centimeters long and wide. So great variation in the leaves, and a great variation also in the size and shape of the inflorescence. It's a panicle, or it's paniculate, but some of them are short like this, particularly the ones that are produced late in the year, and then the earlier ones are big and elongated. So this is Magnolia grandiflora, and this is normally called the evergreen magnolia. If you live in China, of course, most, probably more than half of the magnolias that are native to China are evergreen, and so we have to be careful when we use common names to keep these things straight. Anyway, Magnolia grandiflora is native to the southeastern United States, and it forms massive trees, 25 meters tall, big evergreen leaves. These are pretty significant trees in the landscape. The buds are long and pointed at the tips of the branches, and in the leaf axils, the axillary buds are at this time of the year very, very small, almost impossible to see. But as the winter progresses, those buds will become more obvious. But they're there, but they're very, very small. You'll notice the alternate leaf arrangement. That is, the nodes have a single leaf and they alternate up the stem. And the second thing I want to talk about just briefly is something called phyllotaxy, which is the arrangement, the three-dimensional arrangement of leaves around the stem. And when we look at Magnolia grandiflora, you'll see that the phyllotaxy is radial. That is, the leaves radiate sort of equally all the way around the stem. One of the things about Magnolia grandiflora is it's often covered, the leaf backs, as you can see, and the stems are covered in silky hairs, and this is a kind of brownish silky hairs, very, very distinctive, as you can see when you're looking at the backs of the leaves. The leaves themselves, this is a fairly small leaf for this tree. The leaves themselves are elliptic, very, very glossy, dark green above, and as I said before, often with a brown tomentum. We call this a tomentum, or sometimes it's known as an indumentum. And typically when we talk about hairs on the underside of a leaf, if it's sort of continuous hairs, it's known as an indumentum. Tomentum is just the general term for dense hairs. You'll notice when you look at this leaf that there are no teeth, and so we call this an entire margin. The margin has no interruptions, and so it's called an entire margin. Has a petiole. Now I'm really enjoying doing this because the smell of this flower is exquisite, and it smells a little bit like some people have likened it to the smell of a product that you use for shining furniture called Lemon Pledge. And I prefer not to think of commercial products. It does smell very lemony, and it really is a wonderful fragrance. And when this flower is open, and when the tree is full of flowers, and that would be in the summertime, this is a summer flowering magnolia, the smell is intoxicating. It's really very, very lovely. This is an unusual magnolia in that most magnolias flower once over a short period of time and then they're done for the year. But Magnolia grandiflora starts to flower in June, depending on the temperatures, and will continue to flower, and it doesn't flower heavily, but will continue to flower right through almost until frost in Vancouver. So that's sort of 3 or 4 months of flowering. And that's very, very good value for money. Now, I'm going to point out what happens after the flowers are finished. They form these little cone-like seed heads, and if they develop fully, the cones become quite large, and the seeds eventually push out from between the edges of the individual ovaries. And that can be quite attractive, but it doesn't happen very often in Vancouver. We don't get a lot of seed ripening in Vancouver. An interesting thing about the pollination of magnolias is that almost all magnolias are pollinated primarily by little beetles. And the beetles crawl around, and they're pollen-eating beetles. So there's a lot of pollen that's produced in magnolias, but there's no nectar. And so things that would be attracted to nectar, like hummingbirds or bees, while they don't avoid the flowers, they're not definitely attracted to them. There's a certain amount of pollen collecting that goes on by honeybees, and so we do have some visitation by bees, but it's primarily beetles. An interesting thing about magnolias, Magnolia grandiflora, is that if you go and collect seed of Magnolia grandiflora and grow the seedlings and plant them out in Vancouver, most of them will die. And the reason is that the tree is adapted to the hot, humid climate of the southeastern United States. And it's only through selecting plants that will tolerate a much broader range of temperatures, cooler soils, that we have good Magnolia grandifloras to grow in Vancouver. And there are half a dozen that are excellent candidates, and I'm sure you can look those up if you look at local commercial sites. They will list the Magnolia grandifloras that do well here. So heat, the more heat and the more humidity you have, the better off you're going to be. And so siting magnolia is then important, which means that you don't want to plant it in a kind of an open windswept site, but rather you want to plant it somewhere where it's going to get some heat, that is preferably facing south, with something behind the tree. So with respect to soils, garden soil, regular garden soil is probably adequate for Magnolia grandiflora, but like so many things that come from hotter climates, without good drainage, this is a plant that's not going to tolerate Vancouver conditions. Now I want to say one last thing about Magnolia grandiflora and about broadleafed evergreen trees in general, and that is that they produce, and you can see how dense this tree is. You can imagine how shaded this the ground under a tree like this can become. And so in the summertime that's great, nice and cool, but in the winter it's a bit too dark in the landscape, and we have difficulty, in fact, growing things under Magnolia grandiflora. That's something you need to think about. It's a good sort of specimen tree in the right place, but it's not something that you want to plant a lot of because it casts a very, very heavy shade. And we're really looking for the light in the wintertime. So this is Parthenocissus quinquifolia, what we call Virginia creeper. It's a climber. It's named quinquifolia, which means with 5 leaves, and it's named Virginia creeper because it's native to the eastern part of North America, including in Virginia. And of course, Virginia is named for the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, but that's a whole other story. So above me, we have, it's a fairly good example of how this climbs. It climbs by way of tendrils, and those tendrils are borne opposite the leaves. So if we're looking at a stem, we have a leaf. It looks like an opposite arrangement, and it is an opposite arrangement if you consider the tendril opposite to a leaf. But in fact, it's an alternate arrangement with the leaves alternating down the stems. As I said, 5 leaflets. It is a compound leaf, and it's what we call a palmately compound leaf with 5 different sized leaflets, all radiating from a central petiole. So if you were to look for buds, you might have some difficulty finding the buds because, again, at this time of the year, they're mostly hidden. And when we see buds that are hidden, small buds, that's usually an indication that the plant grows in a cold climate, and it's protecting its buds, and so they only very slowly enlarge as it gets closer to leaf emergence in the spring. So back of the leaf, different color than the top of the leaf, and of course you're seeing the fall color starting to develop now. This is kind of burgundy red and will go a really good scarlet or almost a vermilion color in the fall. So it's often grown for its fall color, and in my opinion, it looks fantastic when it's sort of draped along a structure rather than completely covering a structure. So it does sort of droop down, as you can see, and can look really great in that respect. So this is a member of the grape family, and like most grapes, it has a very, very small flower and a berry-like fruit, and these are pollinated by bees, I suppose, but they typically don't flower at this, in Vancouver, they don't flower normally until late in the year, and so seldom develop fruit, except where they're planted in a hot place where the flowers can come on earlier. Now, a curious thing about the tendrils is that they twine like a grape tendril does, which is typical, but they also, and this is really what differentiates the genus Parthenocissus from other grapes, one of the things that differentiates it, is that the tendrils have little sucker pads that help it to stick. And so it's not only a twining climber, or twining tendril climber, but also a self-sticking climber. These tendril pads can stick to wood or masonry or almost anything. This is Quercus garryana. We call this Garry oak. In the U.S., it's often called the Oregon white oak. It's native to Western North America, and British Columbia, southwestern British Columbia, really is just at the very northernmost part of the range of Garry oak. But it does grow well here, particularly in the rain shadow areas, Vancouver Island and other parts of the south coast. Now, this is a tree. It's a fairly large tree. I would call it a medium-sized tree. It's an oak, and it looks like an oak. It has that sort of heavy look of an oak. The buds, very, very prominent buds, and it's a relatively easy oak to recognize because of the sort of tawny brown hairs that cover the buds. The leaves are simple leaves. They are pinnately lobed, but the pinnate lobes are typically asymmetrical. That is, they're not even on each side, and so they're quite distinctive as a result of that. They have relatively long petioles. That is, the stalk, and so the leaves stick out. And the reason that I'm telling you this is that Quercus robur, the English oak, which is often confused, has much, much shorter petioles, and we'll see that when we look at the Garry oak. It also has slightly more regular looking leaves than the Garry oak. Garry oak, I don't see any acorns on the tree, but Garry oak, like all oaks, is a wind pollinated tree, and little catkins come out in the spring, and you mostly don't realize that they're there. They're so small, and the acorns are produced, and we get, every once in a while we'll get a good year and we'll have lots of acorns, but mostly we don't get a lot of acorns on Garry oak. Now the acorns are quite round or quite spherical, and they're often borne very tight to the branch. We'll look for some acorns to see if we can see that. Like all oaks, the arrangement is alternate. The back of the leaf lighter than the top of the leaf. They're quite hairy when they just shoot in the spring, and there are hairs on the stems, but they're very, very thin hairs, and they're easily dislodged. In terms of the ecology of Garry oak, I mentioned that this is a rain shadow species. That means that it grows where there's not as much rain as we get on, for example, in Vancouver. We get about, what do we get? Almost 1.5 meters of rain on this side of the Salish Sea. On the western side of the Salish Sea, they get half as much or even less rain, and that suits the Garry oak much more, which means that if you're trying to grow Gary oak in this climate, you have to give it very, very well-drained soil so that the water doesn't stick around the roots, because it doesn't like that. Like other oaks, it needs sun. It's a full sun plant. And if you're interested in Gary oak and other oaks, the oak culture, like pre-agriculture oak culture, is a fascinating thing to look into. People actually, First Nations people, collected and traded acorns all up and down the coast. This is English oak, Quercus robur. Quercus robur is native to Europe, but it's so ubiquitous in the Vancouver area that people often think that it's native. In fact, they often think that it's a Gary oak because they think that Gary oak is native to Vancouver. Gary oak, of course, is not native to areas with high rainfall, and so it's not native here. But English oak is much more adaptable. It's a big tree, and it's spread. Its acorns are collected by the eastern gray squirrel, which is a non-native squirrel, and squirrels plant acorns everywhere, and then they sometimes remember where they planted them, and when they don't, then we often will get an English oak tree. And so most of the English oaks that are in the city of Vancouver or in the surrounding area were actually not planted, or not planted by people, but were planted by squirrels. Now, it's a magnificent tree when it gets to be 60 or 70 years. When it's young, it can look kind of gawky, and so it's worth the wait. Of course, I'm fond of saying that the best looking English oaks are 250 years and up. Now, compared with the Gary oak, which we just saw, you'll notice that the leaves are also pinnately lobed, but they're sort of slightly more regularly pinnately lobed. The lobes are rounder, and the sinuses, that is the space between the lobes, is not so deep. They also have very, very short petioles. In fact, they appear when you look at the leaves around the tip of the branch, they often look as though the leaves are sessile. Sessile just means without a stalk. They do, of course, have a stalk, but it's not very big. The buds are obvious at this time of the year. They're smaller than those of the Gary oak, and they're brown, but they're not covered in that nice soft hair. Just like the Gary oak, the English oak produces catkins, male pollen-bearing catkins in the spring, and the acorns develop over the summer. And I've got an acorn here, which I'll show you in a minute or so. And the difference between the Gary oak acorn and the English oak acorn is really obvious. The Gary oak acorn is born on a very, very short stalk, and the English oak acorn is born on a very long stalk, and the acorns themselves are a different shape. English oak has a more bullet-shaped acorn. Now, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of sooty mold on the surface of these leaves, and this is because particularly late in the season there's lots of aphid feeding on English oak, which is one of the reasons that people consider it a kind of a weedy tree. It's really only appropriate for parks and wide boulevards and that kind of thing. It's incredibly adaptable. It doesn't care if it doesn't rain here for 3 months in the summer. Once it's established, it grows. The only thing that it doesn't like is if the soil doesn't drain, but beyond that, it is a superb grower in this climate. This is Tilia tomentosa, what's known in North America and much of Europe, at least, as the silver linden. In England, this is known as the silver lime. For whatever reason, they call Tilia lime in Britain. But most of us call this linden, and the silver linden is a tree. It's a large tree. In fact, it's a massive tree, but a lovely tree. And in years past, I would talk to students about 3 or 4 linden species, Tilia species, but we now essentially only talk about Tilia tomentosa, and the reason for that is that you'll notice the back of the leaf on the silver lime is silvery gray, and that comes from hairs on the back of the leaves. And in fact, the hairs are not only on the back of the leaves, but also on the twigs and on the buds as well. And what those hairs do is they prevent the feeding of aphids. And Tilia are famously good for aphids and other insects with sucking, piercing, sucking mouth parts. And so this is a relatively clean tree, although you can see some holes from some other kinds of insects. It's not really a problem. As I say, a big tree, leaves that are alternately arranged. See the alternate arrangement. And Tilia leaves are, in general, heart-shaped, and but not just heart-shaped, but oblique, or obliquely heart-shaped. And obliquely heart-shaped just means that they're not symmetrically heart-shaped. They're a little bit off-center. And these have fairly coarse marginal serrations. So the leaves, in fact, the leaves on almost all Tilia are similar. And you can see that they change in size depending on where they are on the branch, but otherwise they all have a similar kind of look. Now, Tilias produce flowers in early summer or late spring, and those flowers hang from the branches, little yellow flowers, and they're pollinated by bees, and they smell fantastic. They're very, very popular with both bees and beekeepers, but also with the sort of general public because of the what they smell like. But they also, once the flowers are pollinated, they produce a little nut-like fruit that hangs from a stalk, but that stalk has a little wing on the stalk, and it probably won't work, it never does, but well, it did a little bit. This is the way that the fruits, the seeds are dispersed away from the mother tree. So I was going to talk a little bit more about the fruits, and I'm just going to grab a piece here just to show you that they produce all of these fruit are associated with a wing, and this is a kind of a feature as the leaves fall off the tree in the fall and in the winter. You can still see these. They're attractive to some degree. They tend to go brown until they fall off. Tilias are easily grown, very tough trees. They actually very popular street trees because they're so tough and drought tolerant. At least drought tolerant in the sort of normal sense. Not if we have prolonged drought, then almost any tree needs water. Again, well-drained soil, like so many trees. There's nothing edible about this other than the honey that's produced, and it is really spectacular. So I would encourage any of you to try linden honey if you can find it.